The Republican Zone is brought to you by Drew Murray, a modern view from the Republican lens, covering local and national news, understanding that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to politics. The Republican Zone airs Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. and Saturday from 3 to 4 p.m.
Good afternoon. You're listening to USLA Media and the Republican Zone. I am your host, Drew Murray, and I'm here with my good friend Leslie ACOSTA from the Voices of Change.
Hi, Drew.
We didn't finish our debate last week.
It's part two.
This is part two. So
Right.
I've confirmed with Danny, our sound engineer, that I won round one. So if I win this, it's over, and you can just say that I'm the winner.
So
if you win, then we're going to have a tiebreaker.
So you honestly believe you won the debate?
Oh,
last time?
absolutely.
Really?
Yes.
Man, you have such a big ego. I love you though.
I am not the only one. We took a vote.
Okay.
I'm not going to tell you who
The only
voted,
vote-
how everyone voted,
Okay.
but I think, well, I know Fred said I won. I'll just give you that.
Fred?
Yeah, Fred said I won.
Okay. So
Danny also said I won, and I won't tell you the rest of the votes.
Okay. So it's a tie then.
Let's just say no one voted for you.
Well, Danny, we're gonna have to have a conversation after this show. Okay.
So I said, hey, you're going to have to come back. We're going to talk about things.
Yeah.
We ended up not even talking much about the legislation last week,
Yeah.
House Bill 1300.
Mhm.
And honestly, more things came out this week. So it's actually good that we are going to talk about it again.
Yeah.
And I know there's some other things you want to talk about, and you're going to try to change the subject. You want to talk about redlining and critical race theory, and we'll dabble in that. But and I know, we'll talk about redlining a lot, but we'll see where the conversation goes.
Yeah. And I think these are, look, these bills are important to discuss. 1300
Mhm.
bill, and also for the viewers to understand that across this country, Drew, right, there's been efforts to restrict, in my opinion, right, my belief, the vote. And so there's been a wave of bills recently throughout this country, through the state legislatures, and becoming law. And so this is important to get in front of this, to talk and discuss whether you're in favor or against
Sure.
it. It's good to have these conversations about what's currently
And we'll
happening
still be friends
across this-
afterwards.
Absolutely. We agree to disagree, but I love you, Drew. I mean,
That's right.
It's
No, you're right.
it's okay to have these discussions and to have these honest, civilized debates. We have to have them.
And
Whether
some
you're
people will
agree-
call these laws restrictions. Some people will say it's securing the vote. I'm actually probably more in the middle, saying, I think the vote is for the most part secure, but I do think there is cheating. For me, it's more having faith in the elections. There are people, no matter what you say, a large percentage of this population in our country, in our state, in our city, believe that elections aren't secure. Now, that's not saying that they think Trump won, and I'm just using that as an example. There are many elections. And one thing I always tell Trump people, just an example, I said, if you think Trump won, I said, and you think he won Pennsylvania,
Right.
then you also have to go back and look at the whole picture. Someone like Tim DeFore came out really was a surprise, and as a Republican won as an auditor general in Pennsylvania. So if you're going to say Trump won, then you got to throw the votes out. Well, then you got to throw a lot of votes out, including Stacey Harry, who won the treasurer election. So,
Yeah.
These are all, for me, it's not about stopping fraud. It's about everyone having confidence in our elections, stopping some fraud, because there is fraud. I'm not saying there was widespread fraud, but it's more about everyone having confidence in our elections, and that means compromise. And the first one of the things we first talk about, I think voter ID is one of those.
Well, it leads into that conversation, right? So for the viewers to understand, 14 states already have enacted 22 new laws regarding voter laws. And so this has this wave of these states enacting these laws was enacted after Trump had lost the election. So we see the ripple effect of this in our state legislatures passing these laws across this country. But let's get a little bit about if you want to get into the voter ID discussion, we can get into that. And just let's take it from there, and then let's break this down for the for the viewer.
And I think a lot of this did start with mail-in voting, and whether you think it's secure, not secure, less secure. Act 77 prior to the pandemic even happened, and the Republican-led legislator voted for Act 77, which allowed mail-in voting. The pandemic caused states around the country to go to mail-in as well, but Pennsylvania was already going to do it. Now, no one expected the amount of mail-ins that they had. And of course, it's natural. There was a pandemic, so people are going to do more mail-in voting. And I don't know what the numbers were. Let's say 15 to 20, maybe 15% is my assumption is what they thought it was going to be. They thought the vast majority were still going to vote in person. Then the pandemic happened, and I think it was half the people, maybe even more, voted by mail-in. So because of, in my opinion, the mail-in having, whether it's people not knowing the law or people just not being fully engaged in believing in mail-in voting is secure, a lot of these laws are starting to come forward, including the state of Pennsylvania, with with House Bill 1300.
Right. You have a total on the table right now, 61 of these laws are running through 18 state legislatures across this country. Now, Congress did enact or passed by the House the For the People Act law, is now awaiting action in the Senate. And basically what that particular law does, or passage of that bill, it would block many of the state level restrictions to move forward or to enact these laws into actual law. So For the People Act is kind of like a blockage for these other states passing.
So it's an overstep of the federal government into the autonomy of state-run elections. Because traditionally, and for over 250 years,
well, listen,
states have run elections, and it's been fine. I mean, look, there's always hiccups. There's always things that happen, and tweaks have to be made. You have new technologies. A number of things happen over time where laws need to be tweaked. But never has the federal government come in and said, we need to completely overhaul and take control of state elections. The states have always done it. And in my mind, part of the brilliance of the Constitution is that the federal government has power, but states also have some level of autonomy as well, and they run their state elections. So in my opinion, why is the federal government now trying to come in and say, okay, well, all of these states run by Republicans, because they are the ones mostly trying to make some of these changes, their legislatures are majority Republicans. Now they're coming and saying, okay, we're going to stop it. We're going to completely overstep, because we want, now that we have control of the House and the Senate and the presidency, we're going to come in and we're going to take control of these elections, because now we have the power to do so. And we might even try to end the filibuster in order so that we can pass this without a 60% majority in the Senate. And what's going to happen then, Leslie? Right now you have a Democratic president. Maybe in 4 years, you will again. It'll be an incumbent. Well, I don't think he's going to be president, but that's a different story. There's going to be a Republican president again. And there's going to be a time when Republicans have the Senate and the House again. So if you get rid of the filibuster, and we're kind of going off topic a little bit, but if this legislation passes at federal level, every like 8 years, whenever kind of power swings, then we'll just change everything all over again. And that's never what's been meant to happen, specifically on elections. The states are supposed to have the power to run their elections.
We agree to disagree on that point. But I think
I made a lot of points. So I'm not sure which one.
The federal government had to step in with this First People Act, obviously, because people of color are at disadvantage with these restrictive laws, right? So 880 bills have been introduced across 14 states for these restrictive laws. And we have to be very careful in allowing states to run by Republicans to pass these laws into law, right? These bills into laws. And so this all came about, as you know, Drew, because of the mail-in voting that occurred in the presidential election. And so that was the reason why all these bills have been introduced, because of what happened in Georgia. And other states where Donald Trump felt that he had won the election, and because of the mail fraud, quote unquote, they had to then enact some bills to ensure that voters have shortened time frame for voters to request a mail-in ballot. And so Georgia and places like that wanted to ensure with these laws that stuff like this didn't happen again, by Trump claiming that he had lost the election, which was not true. You and I know that's not the case. But as a result of the presidential election, we see the effect in these laws as a result of what happened in the past presidential election. That's why all this is coming forward now, and they're trying to do this across this country. And hopefully, with this bill that passed in Congress, in the House, the Senate's going to be able to take this and make it into law to restrict these Republican stronghold state houses to pass these restrictive laws.
So these state houses that were elected by the people of their state. Right. So they're trying to silence the voice of the votes of the people in that state. Is what is happening.
I don't think people are trying to silence. I don't think the bill, First People Act, is to silence the people. I think is to protect the people.
It's to take away power.
It's not taking away power, and we'll get into the voter ID and how that is also.
Well, let's look at that. So let's look specifically at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania wants voter ID, and basically, part of the legislation. And actually, when we even spoke last week, because not all the articles spoke about it, and I will be honest, I have not read all 180 pages of.
It's a lot
of House Bill 1300.
Right.
And we talked about this last week. You said the first thing they need to do if they're going to have voter ID laws is they need legislation that is going to give everyone who doesn't have ID, free ID. And what I've read and realized, it's already been handled in this bill. The bill HB 1300, the State Department at a state level. So counties will not be responsible for this. They will pay for IDs for every single person in the Commonwealth who is eligible to vote. So if you're 90 years old, you don't have a driver's license, you can get an ID for free. And if you cannot get that license, all you need to do is walk in to vote. If you don't have ID, you'll just have to sign an affidavit. That's all you got to do. I am Andrew Murray, and I am actually the person voting. Here it is. I'm signing. I walk in. So I ask you the question. Mm-hmm. So it's voter ID. But if you don't have the ID, we'll send you one. And if you don't have it, all you have to do is sign an affidavit. There's not one smidgen of restriction in that voter ID law, which is why I think it's brilliant the way the Republican legislators wrote this bill. There's no restriction whatsoever. Will someone maybe think twice about going in and pretending they're someone else if they have to sign that affidavit? I think they will. It's almost like a notary. What do notaries do anymore? But you are actually signing something saying you are who you are. So I think that piece, and I can't speak to every single law around the country, but even the governor of Pennsylvania himself has said, I don't know why he vetoed the bill if he said it wasn't as restrictive as he thought it was. I guess he didn't read House Bill 1300 in the article that I said, because he said he didn't realize that it was going to be less restrictive than what they've done in the past, which, again, I don't know how you veto a bill and then say you didn't realize something.
Right.
So let's specifically on this voter ID in Pennsylvania, do you think that voter ID portion of House Bill 1300 is fair?
No.
Why?
It doesn't. And I'll tell you why. Let's just put this into perspective. Let's go across the United States, then we'll come here to Pennsylvania, and I'll tell you why it's not fair. More than 30 million people across this country in the United States, they do not have currently an ID. 30 million people in this country. And so an ID that's issued by a government authority, that means that about 11% of the population do not have these IDs and do not have the right to vote. If there are strict laws in place, like voter ID, that does not allow them to vote because they don't have an ID. Unless they find the money to pay for their identification, that's a cost involved in it. And I'll explain the cost that's involved in this. So even if Pennsylvania, like you just stated, gives the identification for free to these individuals, it's yours, it's free, you don't have to pay for it, there's still a cost associated with this, and I'll explain that to you. Pennsylvania, okay, we'll give you the free ID. There are several costs that people don't necessarily know that are attached to this, because in order for you to get an ID, you have to get your birth certificate. In some instances, people like myself, that I was born in Puerto Rico, I have to send for that. I have to get that birth certificate from Puerto Rico, and there's a cost associated with that. A person that's poor, that don't have money, that is not working, cannot afford to get those additional paperwork needed to get you an ID. So even if it's free, you still have costs associated with this and with the documents that you're going to need to get the voter ID. Then you have to travel somewhere to have your application processed. That's another fee and another cost. So if you combine the cost of the travel expenses, the waiting time, the documents, the fees that you have to get, you're talking about per person almost $175 per person just to get the ID, even if the government gives that to you for free. What poor person, Drew, especially in Philadelphia, can afford $175 for an ID when they can use that money for food or for other expenses rather than for an ID? So that's the second issue.
So you're making a comment that it's $175 for any poor person.
Estimated.
I assume.
Estimated.
Guess what? Just because someone is in poverty doesn't mean they have that they have no means to do something for themselves. They're not. They absolutely. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are poor who have their birth certificate, have their social security number. And I'll go back and it'll be the final argument. If you have none of these, there is zero cost to walk in and sign an affidavit stating that is the person you are.
The issue is not going in and signing the affidavit. That's not the issue. The issue is obtaining the documents necessary to get you the ID, even if the government gives that to you for free. The other issue to this
HB 1300 says if you don't do that, all you need to do is walk in.
You need to verify who you are. They're not just going to give you an ID. You have to have certain documents to prove that you are the person.
But right now you don't have an ID, Leslie ACOSTA. You don't have an ID, and you can't afford to get that ID.
Not afford. If I go to the processing center, which is PennDOT, to get the ID, and the government and the Pennsylvania says, okay, you can go to PennDOT and get it for free, I'm required to show certain documents to prove that I'm the person that says that I'm the person.
Well, that's another. Together, there's 8,000 things that you need an ID for in this world. This is one. There are not people who are going in to vote who don't have. I would say 99.999% of the people who are going in to vote have ID already, and those who don't can easily get it. And those who can't easily get it, all you need to do, Leslie, is sign your name on a piece of paper.
You need to prove who you are.
No, that's what you're missing.
How you're going to just sign? So anybody can buckle up and say, my name is Leslie ACOSTA, let me sign here.
Well, right now that's how you vote now.
No, you don't. You have to show some form of identification.
In the state of Pennsylvania, no, you do not.
When I registered to vote, yes, you have to put
I'm saying when you go in to vote, when you are walking into the polling booth, the first time, number one, if you really look at the law the way it's set up already, people who vote already have to show ID, because the first time you walk into a polling station, the first time you must show ID. The second time you don't.
Well, right, but
so if you voted ever in your life, at one point you had to show ID.
Let's get back to the issue. It's not about people showing up the day of to vote. I'm talking about the voter ID laws that they're trying to pass in Pennsylvania, getting the people. Getting a certain individuals this ID is going to cost the individual approximately $175 when you do the breakdown to get this ID, even if Pennsylvania offers this for free. The second issue to this point is when you obtain a voter ID, it's only valid. The information on the ID does not change. Now, however, if that information does change, like your address, you have to update certain information on your identification. Many jurisdictions, including Pennsylvania, only gives you approximately 30 days to take care of this issue. And failing to do such a thing, what happens? It limits your access to voting and other ID benefits if you don't do this. And this is in Pennsylvania as well.
Well, of course, if you have a change of address or a change of name, yes, you have. There are things you must do. That's anything. If you want to get a PICO bill, if you want to get a PGW bill, these are all things. If you want to set up a new account, these are all things that have to be done and are done whether people are rich, poor, or in the middle.
I agree.
So
I'm not disagreeing.
So there's no argument there. So these are things that have to be done. This is part of. You know what? It's part of living a life as an adult, whether you're poor or rich or in the middle.
Two more things that I want to highlight here, and then we can either continue the conversation or move to something else. But two more things that I have to highlight when it comes to voter ID here in Pennsylvania and even throughout this country. So there was a study that was conducted by the GAO in 2014, and they found, and in 2019, and they found that the presence of strict voter ID laws can actually reduce the levels of voter turnout up to 3% across this country. I'm not talking Pennsylvania, across this country. And so that means that there are tens of thousands of votes missing from the overall tally because of these laws if they continue to be enacted throughout this country. So since voter ID legislation impacts, as you know, poor families, because it does impact poor families.
I don't think poor families are as
often,
incompetent as Democrats say they are. It doesn't, just because you're doesn't mean you're incompetent. And Democrats always assume poor people are incompetent and don't have the ability to do anything.
Poor people are not incompetent.
Well, no, the
I'm not saying that you can't attach poorness to incompetence. That's two separate.
No, that's exactly what you're saying.
Separate issues.
But the $175 that you stated, you are making an assumption that every poor person doesn't have any of those documents and can't do any of that.
I'm not saying. In its majority, look, Drew.
When most of them have the documentation that will be needed in order to get ID.
When we isolate this to Philadelphia, when we isolate this to Black and brown people, the majority of Black and brown people that live in low wealth communities cannot afford to pay $175.
Again,
and I'm not overgeneralizing.
You're using $175, assuming every single person.
And I'm gonna give you the breakdown.
Is that an average?
I'm gonna give you an average, and I'm gonna give you the breakdown. But you have to let me give you the breakdown. So the point to this is that there's a trend across this country in Pennsylvania for fewer Democrats to vote and to restrict the voting because of these strict laws that they're trying to pass in our voting laws. That's the other issue. Let's talk about the high price tag to get voter ID. This is going to cost money. It's not going to be free. The government is just not going to, they're going to give it free to the people, but it's going to cost the taxpayer money to be able to enact this and to implement this in Pennsylvania. It's not going to be free. There's a price tag attached to this.
So Leslie, we're gonna have to rerun the tape, because last week you said if we can get these people IDs for free, then we can start talking about voter ID. You said it last week. You said it was okay last week.
I'm not saying that it's.
You absolutely said it.
Even if the government, even if I say once again it's free and it's great and the government is doing a good thing, they're being good Samaritans, giving this free to the people. Let's say, let me give you that argument. They're going to give it free to the people. There's still a cost attached to this, and that cost will be attached to the person that will obtain this ID. So the states that already actively have implemented these laws into place, which is currently now 14 states, 22 states pending these restrictive laws. They're spending millions, not thousands, millions of dollars to ensure that there is an integrity with the elective process, which we agree should be in place. For example, and I just said this to you, Indiana spent $10 million, okay, just to produce free identification cards for people. That's an expensive price tag. Hold on. And so Texas spent just $2 million on educational programs and outreach efforts to educate the people on this. So who's paying for this, Drew? Who's going to pay for this?
The taxpayers.
Why are we adding more?
Let me get this straight, ladies. So those who are in extreme poverty, who don't have any of the documentation, which is just not accurate, who are not probably paying taxes, and I don't think people in severe poverty should be paying taxes. Those are the people you're saying that can't get these IDs. So then people who can pay taxes are allowing those people to get IDs. So basically,
why should we put that burden on the people? Why should we put the burden of the tune of tens of millions of dollars on taxpayers? Why should we do that?
So as a Democrat, you were really saying here to me right now that voter education and something that will broaden voter participation should not be spent because taxpayers are spending it. That is an insane thing for you to say right now. That is insane.
No, you're putting in my
No,
mouth.
I
Twisting-
literally repeated what you
you're
said.
no,
I repeated
twisting
what
my
you said.
information. I think all that is great. What I don't agree with is spending money to restrict people from exercising their right to vote when you're imposing strict laws, especially in low wealth communities like Philadelphia. And so
should we spend
the issue here of restricted people and restricting the voting has to do with this issue of fraud that came right from the horse's mouth of Donald Trump. So all of these states have now tried to enact these restrictive laws. Now, if we look at really how much fraud has been committed across this country, Drew, people that have committed fraud in voting, guess how much? Can you tell me what the percentage is?
Well, guess what? We have
What's
to take
the
it. No,
percentage?
we have to take a break because our engineer is saying we have to take a break. So I will guarantee you that Leslie will say Donald Trump's name at least 5 more times, even though he lost the election last year and
I'm
has
glad he
nothing to
did.
do with this discussion.
He has
You're
everything
listening
to
to Usula Media and the Republican Zone. Welcome back. You're listening to Usula Media and the Republican Zone. I am your host, Drew Murray, with my friend Leslie ACOSTA from Voices of Change. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I know you had something you really had to say, but if I didn't do a commercial break, Danny, our engineer, would
That's good.
He would have hit pause on us. So I'm going to let you continue your thought.
Well, you said prior to the break or during the break that Trump already lost the election. I agree. That he's not even up for discussion.
Then why do you keep bringing him up?
Hold on. But because of what happened with Donald Trump, this is the domino effect of these states trying to implement these restrictive laws. So all of these issues, but the question that I had, how many, to be quite honest with you, Drew, there's been very few cases where someone misrepresents who they are or reporting to a local precinct to vote and they shouldn't have. You know how many people have actually, 31 people. In the entire United States. I mean, this is ludicrous what they're trying to do, but that's to have another discussion. And the other thing that we need to do, Drew, and I'm putting this into perspective, is if we're going to do this voter ID, we have to have a reliable delivery system for ID cards. And given as an example, what happened with the COVID-19 and the vaccines being rolled out here in Pennsylvania, it was a mess. People were not able, there was not an effective delivery system. So imagine with the voter ID. So all that stuff has to come into play. Money has to come into play. That's a factor. A delivery system has to be in place. There's things that have to be done in order to do this correctly, effectively, and efficiently. That's just my view on it.
And now another part of House Bill 1300 is actually allowing drop boxes now legally, not by the Supreme Court, but allowing drop boxes, expanding in-person voting. So these are all things, Leslie, and that's what compromise is. And you don't compromise. Compromise is, okay, we might not love that. We might not love the voter ID law, but if Democrats really love drop boxes, if Democrats really love, and Republicans love expansion of voting as well. We just don't like expansion of voting in a way that's only going to benefit one party. So we want expansion of voting. We just want it to have people to have faith in voting. We want it to be secure. But the big thing is, because you said, I understand that there's not widespread fraud, but just because there's only 31 cases that are caught, that doesn't mean it's not happening. So this is the way compromises work. And compromises don't work by saying, okay, I'm a Texas legislator and I don't like these laws, so going to fly to Washington, D.C.
Absolutely.
Or if these are laws that I don't like, even though these legislators were voted in by the people of these states, I'm going to call up my congressman and say, hey, can you please do a bill at the federal level that prevents our states from making decisions for themselves?
Let me ask you
that
this
is
question.
Not how compromises work.
And
last but not least, and it's funny, things like the Electoral College and filibusters, they've been around for 250 years. They were never a problem. The first time I ever heard that there was a problem with the Electoral College, when
Hillary Clinton.
When it rarely happens, when someone wins. And no, actually, I would say it started with Al Gore, because he won the popular vote by
lost the Electoral College.
but lost. And then all of a sudden, Democrats say, and guess what? I was at that time, I was a Democrat. I did vote for Bush, but I was a Democrat. There were never problems with the Electoral College. Now all of a sudden, it was a horrible thing. But then that went away. And then when Hillary, again, it was a very small percentage she won by. She won millions of votes. It's a very small percentage lost by. Now the Electoral College. Now let me finish my statement. And now that I never heard the filibuster being a problem, and Donald Trump was president and Republicans held the House and the Senate. The filibuster was never a problem, and Democrats used the filibuster. Now it's a problem because Democrats have the House, the Senate, and the executive branch in President Biden. Now they want to get rid of it. They want to change the rules when it suits them. If the filibuster was ended under Donald Trump's presidency, the first 2 years when we held the House and the Senate, Democrats would have gone ballistic.
Let me ask you this.
Yes, or just say yes or no. Do you think?
No, I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that?
At all.
You're telling me if Republicans ended the filibuster in 2017 and basically enacted any law that they wanted to without any input from Democrats.
That would never happen. But
that's what the end of the filibuster is going to be.
Let me ask you this question. Do you believe that Republicans across the state and across the United States don't commit fraud?
In elections?
Yes.
I'm sure there's fraud in elections and on
yes or no?
in everybody.
Is that a yes or no answer?
Yes, Democrats and Republicans commit fraud.
Okay. So it goes both sides, Drew. And but what makes it so lopsided is that Republicans make it seem that the ones that are the biggest culprit of committing fraud, of cheating, is solely on the shoulders of the Democrats, and that's not true. No. Primary example of that was what happened in North Carolina. The congressman that ran, the Republican, who was caught outright cheating, committing voter fraud. He was a Republican, not a Democrat, a Republican, and that he had to concede that seat to a. And
what did he do specifically that was voter fraud?
I guess they tallied votes, and I think there were ballots. And I don't want to really mention this because I can't. I don't want to.
We can revise it if it's wrong.
No,
we make mistakes.
I don't want to misquote information, but I do know that the election was overturned because he was caught handedly committing fraud, and I think they were with mail-in ballots. Where additional votes were counted fraudulently, and it was a Republican. So it's a primary example that it occurs on both sides of the aisle.
So mail-in ballots make it easier to cheat.
I don't think that it makes it easier to cheat. What I'm saying is, that in instances of voter fraud, it happens on both sides of the aisle. It is not one or the other. It has happened, and it continues to happen. And it will continue to happen, Drew.
It will continue happening, but why not make it more secure? Here's a example of what happened last election. I have a friend who's a committee person.
Yeah.
Great person, nice woman, Democrat committee person. I saw her on the street walking around. I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" She's like, "Oh, I'm just collecting ballots from people who can't get from some of our elderly residents who can't get to the mailbox." And do I think there was any malicious intent there? No. But what was she doing? Was it illegal? It was absolutely 100% illegal. It's called she was doing it. She didn't realize it was wrong. I said, I'm like, you're actually not allowed to do that unless you have an affidavit signed by the person.
Right. People don't know, Drew.
Well, this is part. I guess we should maybe spend some money in order to educate people on.
Well, hold on, time out.
But no, let me finish.
One thing is voter education, and one thing is to restrict people from exercising their right to vote. Two separate we're talking about here, Drew. Okay.
Well, I'm just saying, no, you said that it's cheap on both sides. And I'm saying some people don't. And you know what? I bet Republicans did the same thing. So I'm not saying it was, but
And that's why you have
the bottom
committee of
line
70 of
is
those
the
folks
bottom
do
line
it.
is there was ballot harvesting done. This is a person who's a friend of mine. It's beyond reproach her intentions there. It was purely just to help people get their ballot to the ballot box because they were older. But you know, when we talk about these things, this is just making the public feel that the elections are secure. It's faith in our electoral process.
The elections are secure, Drew.
But why not make it more secure?
Why?
Why change? Okay.
Why restrict?
So you're saying why
more
change
restriction
things?
on our?
So why change things?
Why? Why? What's the rhyme and reason
So
to restrict
if you shouldn't
more?
change it, then the federal government shouldn't change anything right now and take any of the states. Because why change it?
They have to because of the wave of bills being introduced in state legislatures.
But it's compromises, Leslie.
That are controlled by
They're going to
Republicans.
expand in-person voting to more than one day, and which we actually already had in the last election, and it should have been illegal because they were calling them drop-off locations, and their drop-off locations, this includes Philadelphia, a drop-off location, you could go in, you could register, literally on site, you could get your ballot, you could fill it in, and then you could put it in the drop box. That's not a drop-off location, that's an early voting location.
Got that argument.
But Republicans who wanted to be in there to make sure, your poll watchers, they would not allow poll watchers in to watch those early voting locations. There were a lot of problems.
Fair enough. I agree. But why introduce more restrictive laws when it comes to our voting? Why? What's the reason behind that?
So people have faith in our elections.
You even said that there was no fraud committed.
I didn't say no fraud. No, I did not say there was no fraud.
That President Trump did lose the election fairly and squarely. Why then the introduction of these restrictive laws? Why?
Because I think we as secure as possible without restricting the right to vote. And the way the voter ID law, I'm not going to speak to all states, the way the voter ID law in the state of Pennsylvania, it was genius. It does not restrict to vote at all. It just secures our vote. And the reason you have to do it, Leslie, and we spoke about this last week, quite literally, George Bush beat Al Gore by 600 votes. No, I'm using it as an example that's, well, if it's not widespread fraud, it doesn't matter. But it can matter because in that case, the United States won election by 600 votes. And Democrats will probably that election was stolen. It was maybe if they were more secure.
It wasn't. The jury rendered their verdict. Bush won the election. That was then. And no one claimed fraud. No one claimed none of that, that it was stolen. Why restrictive laws? And it's all, I got one reason and one reason only: to restrict people's right to exercise their vote, which gets into the conversation that we're going to have, Drew, that we touched upon a little bit at the last segment, which is redlining here in the United States. And what does that mean? And we all know that redlining, and you gave a little bit of information on it last time, but it's a systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods, often Black and brown. And that's what redlining is. And we can get a little bit into it and not get too much into the weeds in this.
You're broadening the term a little bit. You're not just talking about redlining itself was about mortgages and banks.
We're going to get into that.
Are you broadening that definition?
Well, remember, redlining, if we really look at this issue of redlining, let's go back to 1933. Let's go back to the housing shortage. The federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing stock. Okay, so this all began in the 1930s under the New Deal. So if we really want to get into the weeds of redlining, it's not only about mortgages and banks not wanting to do business in certain neighborhoods. It was a systematic denial of various services to Black and brown communities.
And as part of the New Deal.
It was part of the New Deal. It was part of the federal government program to do this. So this was intentional, specifically that occurred, and the federal government had their hands all over this. And so, look, I know that
it was a Democrat who was in charge then. But you understand?
It doesn't.
It doesn't make it right. I'm not saying it makes it right.
It doesn't make it right. It doesn't. But it was wrong, right? So it was, in 1993, there was a shortage. You know what happened during that time? We were in a huge crisis. Okay, so the term redlining comes from, do you know where it comes from? It comes from the development by the New Deal. That's where it comes from. By the federal government of maps that were drawn of every metropolitan area. That's how this came about in the country. And those maps were color-coded, specifically color-coded by first the Homeowners Loan Group. That was the company that did it. And then by the Federal Housing Administration. And then they adopted and was adopted by the Veterans Administrations. And these color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. So this is where you get into the banks and get into this conversation. And anywhere where there was people of color, in particular African Americans, where they lived, anywhere nearby these color-coded maps, it gave appraisers and mortgage companies restriction to do business because it was considered to do business in those areas because it was considered to be
now were these redlined areas, were they determined by race or
by race?
No.
By
were
race.
they determined by race?
Absolutely.
Or poverty?
By race
or poverty?
Race and poverty, both.
I would disagree with you. It was done by poverty, and it was wrong. I'm not saying it was right.
It was by race.
It was
and
wrong.
poverty.
It was wrong. It was done by poverty,
it
was done because of a risk management, and it was wrong, and it should not have been done. But it had nothing to do with race.
Absolutely.
Everything. Did it affect black and brown people more?
Absolutely, it did.
I did. I agree with you.
Absolutely,
but that's not a race reason. This was not done for race. It was done. So instead of helping people get out of, the chains of poverty, it restricted it. And does that affect black and brown people more? Yes, but that doesn't mean. Do you think Franklin Delano Roosevelt? You think he sat there and said, "I want you to go to these communities that are black and brown, and I want you to restrict them"?
He gave that to other people to do his dirty work. Basically, that's what it was. And the government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white middle class, lower middle class families, and denied people of color and people of new suburban communities, and push these black and brown people out of these communities and even housing projects. So it was tilted heavily towards providing for middle class people and leaving people of color out of this. And so if we look at the history of things being done with the federal government, talking about the voter laws, talking about the voter ID, talking about redlining, all of this are attempts and intentional attempts to restrict people to certain access to things.
Okay. And I will say that it was wrong. Now, it was almost 100 years ago, Leslie.
It doesn't matter.
Redlining does not happen today. It absolutely does not.
Absolutely.
Absolutely does not. The government on a systemic level is not quote unquote
Drew,
redlining
I'll
areas
tell you why it does
and
exist.
Restricting banks and other bubusinesses from entering those areas. It does not happen anymore.
I'll tell you this, and it does happen today, and I'll explain this.
I'll give you an example of how this happens
currently today, which continues to exist. There's a manual. It's called the Underwriting Manual of the Federal Housing Administration. That exists today. We're not talking about 1933. We're talking about 2021, which said, quote, incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to Africans cannot be insured. This is not 1933. This is currently happening now in our community.
Well, after this, you were going to email me that documentation, because if that is something, I don't.
And if you don't look it up, research it.
No, document it. Put a footnote and email it to me.
It's called Underwriting Manual of the Federal Housing Administration. You go to that manual, and there's this language in there.
And is it practiced? If there's some weird language that is still in some document that is 100 years old, but is it practiced?
Primary example of it being practiced is right here in North Central Philadelphia. HUD has been shut down in North Central Philadelphia. You cannot get PHA housing here in North Central Philadelphia. They've moved people out, people of poor means. They've moved them out because now, as you see this area, what we have in this area is a different community, diverse, but is a different community, more affluent community, people that are earning more. I would say $50,000 or more that can afford to pay the rent of these houses being built right here in where this studio sits in. So this has not changed, and redlining is a real thing, very real, and continues to exist in communities of color.
So you're stating that gentrification is redlining. If a developer comes in and purchases land, number one, that person, more often than not, it is a private sale. So if a person who is poor wants to sell their property, that is 100% their right. No, that is 100% their right, Leslie. Oftentimes what happens in these gentrifying areas, it's people who live in those communities who say, you know, I purchased this house for $20,000 20 years ago, and now it's worth $200,000. I'm going to cash in and make a profit. And they have every right to do that. Now, if you state that they don't want to sell, I'd say the vast majority do want to sell, and that's why gentrification happens. It's people cashing in on a profit, and I think that is actually that is a good thing. But if you say it's because no, they get costed out because of the taxes going up. You know, we did talk about that. There are ideas and there are cost of living adjustment ties that you could put onto the sale of properties that will be tied to the cost of living. So the increase in their taxes will only go up as much as the cost of living goes up, which is life, Leslie. That's just life. Inflation happens, life happens. But no, you gotta let me finish. I let you talk about redlining for a good 5 minutes. I didn't interrupt you once because you're tied into gentrification. Gentrification would be very much a good thing as long as we take out the negative aspects. Crime is down. This is a fact. This is not an opinion. Empty parcels that are often a blight to a community are developed on. The value of the properties go up, which is a good thing. Now now the bad thing that everyone ties it to is taxes go up. So we can fix this problem in Philadelphia. We can fix it everywhere by limiting how much taxes can go up by the comps in the neighborhood. Just because someone builds a house that's $1 million next to one that's $100,000 doesn't mean the person who lives in that $100,000 house should have their taxes tripled. I agree with you, but that's not redlining. These are private developers going in and they're purchasing these properties. Now PHA does sometimes sell land, maybe when they shouldn't. But that's by the way, PHA is run by whom? By what party?
It doesn't matter.
But what party?
It does not matter. This is not about the Democrats or Republican. It's doing what is right. These developers are in the pockets of these politicians where they donate a lot of money and they sell these parcels and they sell this land and they have these connections to be able to get this land. Absolutely, this has everything to do with redlining here in our community. And I'm going to give you an example. My house where I live right now was bought for $2,500 in 1974.
Did you buy it?
Right now. My parents bought that house. All right. Today, the taxes on that property are almost $2,000. Right. So in front of where I live, they're selling these homes for $400,000, $500,000, right? And you still have, for instance, like myself, I earn an income, right? I have a decent salary that I earn, thank God. But you have people that live on the same block that have been living there for more than 40 years that cannot afford to pay those types of taxes. They just cannot because they live on a fixed income. They live either on Social Security or disability and they can't afford. You cannot disadvantage people in that way. And so you mentioned that there's people who want to cash in, and sometimes people are forced to cash in because they can't afford to pay those taxes. They go in arrears on the taxes because they can't pay. You have then only a year to catch up or two before you have the department that come in, the department that comes in, the sheriff's sale to come in and threatens to take your home if you're not paying these taxes. And oftentimes if you can't cash in and you can't sell, what happens is department come and take your home, and then they sell this to these developers that have a lot of money that you cannot compete with. So there is an outright disadvantage in low wealth communities, Drew. And this is very much attached to redlining. I don't care how you spin it,
but it's it's attached to poverty. But look, I understand, Leslie, that when the values of homes go up and the taxes are tied to that value, it can be a burden. And as I said,
it's a burden.
There are things that we can do to release that burden. Now, you have to pay taxes, Leslie.
Absolutely, I agree.
You have to pay taxes.
I don't disagree with that, but you cannot. A person that's on the poverty level in the this sits in the 197. It's 150%. 150% poverty level in the 197. You know what's that income in 1 year? We're talking about $7,000. To run a home, to pay water, to pay electricity, to pay your utilities, you don't have enough money to pay all that to sustain yourself. Everything has gone up. Food prices have gone up. Gas price has gone up. Your taxes has gone up in this community. And I'm advocating for the people that cannot afford to pay these taxes. And we cannot disadvantage people like that. It's unfair. It's not right. I don't give a damn if the Democrats are doing it. If the Republicans are doing it, shame on you.
But you're saying that they shouldn't pay any taxes?
I'm saying yes, but it cannot be this. Like I'll give you the example of what's going on with our home. Paying $2,000. Thank God that we have the ability to pay that. There's neighbors that live right next door to me that live on that fixed income. They can't pay that. Shame on the Republicans. Shame on the Democrats for doing that. And the politicians should be enacting laws to help do things fairly for people that cannot afford.
Now, you said the house was purchased in 1970. That was
1974.
74, almost 50 years ago. I don't know what were the taxes
because of this development.
But what were the taxes in 1974? I don't know if you might not even know.
$100.
Because 2,000, I understand 2,000 is a lot of money for a lot of people.
2 years ago, Drew, let me finish. 2 years ago, we were paying $400. 2 years ago. We're now in 2021. It went from $400 to $2,000.
Oh, those numbers don't sound right to me.
Well, it doesn't sound right, but it's correct. When they did the reevaluation of taxes across
the actual value initiative happened about 10 years ago.
100.
But that was 10 years ago.
But they did it, and it went up 100%. I can show you the taxes that we pay.
Well, sometimes
they went up when
they went to the actual value initiative. Sometimes parcels or taxes doubled on parcels or homes on parcels because they were undervalued for so long.
Okay, so bring it up to par.
That's what the actual value initiative did. And they're bringing
it up to par. Why they're bringing it up to par? Because anytime there's a home that's built that's going to cost in that community $500,000, $400,000, obviously then what happens? Your taxes go up. That is an automatic thing. And what I'm saying is, look, I don't mind gentrification. I don't mind to have a diverse community. But when it adversely affects people that cannot pay and that cannot compete with that, it's not right, is wrong, and is wrong on the politician. Not only the Republicans, but the Democrats.
But I already gave you the solution.
No, that's not.
You just have to get me. It's a solution that will work. You just have to vote for me next time I run for office.
Drew, I hope and pray that if and when you do get into office, you do the right thing by the people.
Oh, I'll do the right thing, but part of the right thing is everyone paying their taxes.
Well, not in that sense. Paying their taxes,
you got to pay something.
You can't disadvantage people that cannot pay. And
taxes should not go from 400 to 2,000 in 2 years.
And if that's your mindset, then guess what? I'll get people not to vote for you.
You're going to get the people in your community not to vote for me?
Well, good, Drew.
If they went from 400 to 2,000, that's wrong.
I think we got to go, Drew.
Well, I think we got the 2-minute warning. But if we're ready to wrap it up, then we can wrap it up. Leslie, thank you for coming on the show. We'll still be friends. You got very passionate today.
Absolutely.
I thought you were going to come over and try to punch me in the face.
No,
but it all went well. So thank you again for coming on. You're listening to USLA Media and the Republican Zone. Thank you for listening.
The Republican Zone is brought to you by Drew Murray, a modern view from the Republican lens, covering local and national news, understanding that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to politics. The Republican Zone airs Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. and Saturday from 3 to 4 p.m.